doing all domestic policy. Oh,
or 0 seconds.
yeah. Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks so much, everybody. And I see that we are letting folks into our Zoom, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to join us as we go live with Jake Sullivan here today. We are really honored to be joined for one in a series of conversations that we're having, Jake, with the campaign to try to give the J Street world an insight into what a Joe Biden presidency might mean, what are the stakes of this election, what are some of the positions on the issues that we care most deeply about. And so we're very grateful to you for taking time. I'm sure this is an extraordinarily busy time. By way of introduction, I think many of you probably know Jake Sullivan well. He has spoken at J Street events, and he's been on other webinars and seminars with us, but he is Joe Biden's senior foreign policy advisor. We knew each other, and we all knew him from the Obama administration when he was the national security advisor to Vice President Biden. He was deputy chief of staff at the State Department for Secretary Hillary Clinton. He was one of her senior foreign policy aides in the 2016 campaign. He played a key role in the negotiations over the Iran nuclear agreement. And so there's probably very few people who are as deeply ensconced in the Democratic leadership on foreign policy as Jake. And Jake, I want to open this up at really the highest possible level of generality. You and I had a chance to do a couple of events over the course of the last year and have some private conversations. And at different times we've said, the stakes of this election, we couldn't imagine them being any higher. The loss of American leadership in addressing some of the world's challenges has been so stark. And that was before there was coronavirus. We didn't even, when we were having these conversations, we hadn't even hit the worst of these challenges yet. And I guess the opening question I'd ask to you, the vice president talks about this campaign being a campaign for the soul of America, but really it's a campaign also for the future of the planet. And I'm wondering if you could give a little bit of an overview of what you see as the Biden doctrine. What is sort of the Biden approach to an American role in international affairs, and why does it matter so much for us to see a different direction for the United States?
Thank you, Jeremy, first of all, and thanks to everybody who's on here. It's a great, this is actually a tonic from the daily rigors of campaigning to have the opportunity to take a little bit of time out, to step back and think about some of these bigger questions, Jeremy, like the one that you just posed. With these overlapping crises that we're confronted with at the moment, a global pandemic, an economic crisis that has resulted from that pandemic, a reckoning over racial justice that has been 400 years in the making and is not just limited to the United States, but has reverberated around the world. And of course, the enduring crisis of climate change that the vice president just spoke to today in a speech in Wilmington, Delaware. This has created a kind of crucible moment from the vice president's point of view, where there is a genuine opportunity coming out of these crises to build real momentum towards a better, more sustainable, more just future, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I would say that it really rests on kind of three legs of the stool in a way for him. The first is investing at home. That what these crises have only reinforced is that this old bromide that to be strong abroad, you have to be strong at home. That's not just a talking point. That's, at this point, a fundamental strategic imperative. So over the course of the last 2 weeks, the vice president has been driving his economic recovery agenda, which he calls Build Back Better, which one might think of as a domestic policy agenda, but in my view is a deeply foreign policy agenda as well, because it is about investing in the core sources of America's strength, in our industrial and innovation base, in our infrastructure, in our people, in our kind of capacity to be able to take on the great challenges in a resilient, sustainable, equitable way as we go forward. So that's the first pillar. And he would start any foreign policy speech at this point with a long discussion of what the United States needs to do at home, because we are not going to be able to promote a just and equitable world in a credible way if we are not pursuing a just and equitable country here in the United States. The second leg of it is investing in our allies, which Donald Trump has systematically weakened and undermined, and questioned really the long-term legitimacy and vitality of. And the vice president basically believes that our allies and alliances and partnerships with like-minded democratic countries around the world, not just our treaty allies, but a broader set of countries that share our fundamental values and vision for the world, that is a foundation for effective American strength and engagement in the world. And then the third pillar is rejoining international institutions that are the collective problem-solving mechanisms for challenges that no one country can solve on their own, but that fundamentally still today can't be solved without an active, engaged United States. That's the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization, and so much else that the Trump administration has systematically abandoned. And in doing so, in abandoning those institutions and undermining our alliances and undermining the sources of our strength at home, has given an opening for countries like China and other authoritarian regimes around the world to say, hey, there's an alternative way to do things. You don't have to look to the United States, you can look to us instead, which has allowed for authoritarianism and for strategic competitors of the United States and our partners to really be on the march in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. And so that's sort of how the vice president looks at the world and how he would be approaching things right out of the gate from the first day that he was in office in January of 2021.
I want to ask folks, to the extent that you all have questions that you want to throw into the mix, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screens. I assume everybody's familiar enough with Zoom at this point that you understand that we'll be grabbing some of those questions and I'll be integrating them into the conversation with Jake. Jake, you mentioned investing at home, and then you said investing when it came to allies. And investing gets at the question of money, gets at budget choices. If you want to understand someone's values, you look at their budget. I'm curious, in the context of thinking about a Biden national security agenda, where do you see the relative spending on military and more hard approaches to national security versus some of the more investment-oriented, perhaps softer approaches of aid and economic approaches around the world? Do you see that there would be a space for a shift in the kind of approach that the United States takes in its spending?
Of course. And to answer that question otherwise would be to completely ignore the nature of the threats and challenges we face today. Looking at COVID-19, one place the United States has historically done a decent job in terms of its expenditures globally on development-related issues has been global health. We've been better at that than virtually everything else. And that's damning with faint praise in a way, because it's still not sized in scope to the nature of the challenge that we face. If you think about it, 136,000 Americans have died as a result of COVID-19. On the scale of national security challenges relative to others that we've invested a heck of a lot more money behind, it's hard to argue that we are not underweighted in terms of our investments on that. The vice president today rolled out a $2 trillion investment agenda to deal with climate change and to drive effective job creation in the clean energy and infrastructure spaces on a going forward basis. And, frankly, that's a 4-year commitment, and over the longer term will have to be much more significant. Our diplomacy has been hollowed out, and the Trump administration has continually tried to slash the budget of the State Department. And if you think about the bang for the buck that we get out of something like the Iran nuclear deal, compared to the amount of money that we have spent trying to deal with similar challenges, WMD or aggressive actors in other parts of the world, these are some of the best dollars we could possibly spend, and yet we are not investing enough for the robust diplomatic capability that we need. Meanwhile, China is investing in all of those areas and more, in economic statecraft, in technology, in development, in infrastructure globally. And it is enhancing their capacity to gain influence, to set the rules, to define the terms of engagement in different parts of the world. And other actors are similarly enhancing their soft power capabilities while the United States is basically running in place. So the vice president's view is we need to up our game on the civilian power side of our foreign policy and national security. And even when it comes to defense spending, we have to think less in terms of the historic sort of legacy systems and long-term massive troop deployments that have depleted our treasury, and think instead about new types of threats and challenges in an advanced technology ecosystem, whether it's artificial intelligence or cyber, or capabilities that that aren't these kind of, massive 20-year legacy systems, but are new, more operable, and more sustainable over the mid to long term. So that's the vice president has laid out in both an article in Foreign Affairs and a speech last year his view that we need to reconceive of national security in a much broader sense, and how we resource it. To your point about, and this is something that the vice president himself says a lot, that a budget, don't tell me your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values. This would be very much applicable in the national security domain.
So I am amazed by the number of different questions all over the map that are coming in, because people are so thirsty for these discussions. You mentioned China, and it's not an issue that the J Street's particularly directly engaged in, but it certainly is a key element of shaping a national security agenda in the 2020s. And one of the questions that came in is, what should, in fact, a policy be in light of what's been happening in Hong Kong? And how does that then relate to Taiwan and our commitments to Taiwan? I know it's not a J Street issue, but I do think it's an interesting test. And then perhaps if you could make an elegant segue from talking about China, we might shift to a different challenge, which is the challenge of Iran. And you need China's engagement as part of the P5+1 on an issue like that. Yet you need to challenge it when it comes to something like Hong Kong. So how do you balance that kind of an act? So at least I've connected it somewhat to a J Street issue.
I will connect it even more at the end of my answer on China, because I think there is, just in the news in the last week, an even more pressing connection that gets to this larger issue of America first, meaning America alone. But I mentioned the three legs of the stool: invest in ourselves, invest in our alliances, re-engage international institutions. If you think about what China is looking for right now, if they were basically trying to come up with their maximum strategy for what the US would do in their ideal world, they couldn't ask for much more than what Donald Trump has given them. So their strategy would be, number one, tarnish the American political and economic model, so that the Chinese political and economic model can be held up as a equal or superior alternative. Well, Donald Trump has done quite a bit of good work tarnishing that. The second would be to weaken and divide America's alliances, particularly in Asia, but also in Europe as well. And in fact, Xi Jinping repeatedly, when I accompanied Vice President Biden to meet with him for multiple hours, repeatedly would probe on this question of allies. Like, why don't you guys just give those up? And a big part of the reason for that, of course, is that China, when it looks around at its portfolio of alliances, it's sort of sometimes North Korea, maybe Pakistan occasionally. It's not exactly the list of incredibly capable, effective partners that the United States has. Well, Donald Trump has basically delivered the weakening and division within our alliance system himself. The third is a reduction in US influence in global institutions, paving the way for an increase in Chinese influence in global institutions. Donald Trump, again, has done that for them. And then the final thing is that China would like to dominate the future in key industries and technologies that it thinks are going to be where the action is, in AI and 5G, in batteries and electric vehicles. And Donald Trump spends all of his time talking about coal and battleships and technologies in the 19th century without making any of the investments meaningfully to compete in those areas. So the vice president kind of looks at the flip side of that and says, again, we've got to reinforce the American political and economic model through investment at home. We've got to reinforce our allies through modernizing them and pitching them towards a future. We've got to re-engage international institutions so that the US is effectively asserting a different view than the one that China's trying to impose on the rule-setting institutions of the world. And we've got to effectively compete with China on who is going to own the future with respect to these important technology and economic issues. And we need to do all of that while also being prepared to work with China where it's in our interest. For example, on climate change or on COVID-19. They've been a very bad actor, but I think that's in part because of the mismanagement of that relationship by China. And then finally comes to the point of values. And the question referenced Hong Kong. The vice president has been very clear that in taking these foundational steps that I've described, he would do so with a very clear view that American values have to be at the center of our foreign policy, that we need to speak with a clarion voice on Hong Kong and Xinjiang and any effort that the Chinese government would make with respect to changing the status quo with Taiwan by force. And he has already been out there through this campaign very vigorously, calling out the Chinese government's aggression in those various areas and advocating for very specific steps for forms of targeted sanctions, for cutting off products that are made by forced labor in Xinjiang, for reconsidering the nature of the special relationship with Hong Kong. And he would carry all of that forward as president. And he sees nothing inconsistent between standing very strong for our values and also finding these narrow areas where working with China is necessarily not just in America's interest, but in the larger common interest. Okay, that was a long answer on China, but I'm now going to make the pivot, which is just this week, China and Iran announced a package of cooperative partnerships in the realm of both military cooperation and economic cooperation. How much this will become a reality or not is anyone's guess. Lots of these kinds of announcements don't really go anywhere. But one should not underestimate the degree to which it is a repudiation of the Donald Trump strategy of maximum pressure and a strong shot across the bow of the United States that says, you guys can do all you please from the point of view of walking away from the Iran deal and trying to go it alone with respect to Iran. But just know there's another big economy and big security player out there that can offer alternatives to Iran that fundamentally undermine your strategy and fundamentally set back an opportunity for us to be working with China, Russia, and the rest of the P5+1 to continue to drive towards both nuclear diplomacy and a broader diplomatic approach with respect to Iran. So I think this week's announcement just goes to show you where the future is headed if the United States does not get back to the table in a meaningful way with its partners around the world to deal with the challenges that Iran poses. How is that?
There's a few questions about that specifically. What January 20th means. Let's say we have all done our job, right? And we have been successful in November, and there actually is a change here. January 20th, you would inherit a situation where you've got a JCPOA that is literally on fumes and the shaky last leg or two. What specifically would in fact need to happen? Would the United States, a number of people are asking, would the United States re-enter the specific deal that was signed, come back into compliance with its own obligations and demand that Iran do as well, and then negotiate further? Or do you negotiate before coming back in? What's your sense of the steps that happen along the way?
Well, first of all, I think it's hard to give an absolutely definitive answer to this question. I can definitively say the U.S. would immediately re-engage diplomacy with Iran in consultation with our allies and partners to try to get back to the understandings of the JCPOA and also to figure out how to get a follow-on agreement that built on it. What the exact choreography is of that in the opening weeks, I think depends on three things. First, where are we then? I mean, what more happens between now and then at the United Nations, on the ground? What choices does Iran make? So we have to see where exactly things stand with the JCPOA. Secondly, we need to consult with our allies, in particular our European allies and partners on this, but also consult with the other members of the P5+1 to find out from them, okay, what is actually our best sequence of strategy here? And then third, we need to have an opening round of conversations with the Iranians. What is their understanding and expectation of where we are and where we're headed? Will they even come back into compliance with the JCPOA, given the steps that they have taken and everything that's transpired in between? So we would try to execute on those after seeing where we were, we would immediately dispatch teams to engage our allies, and having done that consultation, engage with the Iranians in a good faith effort to reestablish nuclear diplomacy and get back onto a track that has us within the parameters of the JCPOA, and then building on it with a follow-on agreement. But precisely saying, would we, how do the formalisms of that work and how does the sequence on that work? I think the Vice President has rightly stayed very, very robust and strong in saying, I believe in the JCPOA and I believe in what it delivered, and I am for getting back to that. But the exact nature of what that looks like will turn on that set of factors I just laid out.
So it's a very eclectic group that's watching today, and they want to know everything from TPP to Green New Deal. It's all over the map, but I'm going to zero in on the core issue for J Street, and then we may pull back out and go to other areas because, of course, Israel-Palestine continues to be at the center of J Street's focus. And, I want to start with the issue of the day, which is annexation, and see, if you would share with the J Street world the Vice President's take on annexation. We know that he's opposed on the record. One of the questions, is the Vice President at this point willing to say that were Trump to recognize that annexation on behalf of the United States, would the Vice President de-recognize or take away that formal recognition? And are there any specifics in terms of what an American reaction to annexation should be? I know you're aware of the debates regarding conditioning of aid or restricting of aid or other things like that, and I would love to just hear your take on those issues.
So the Vice President has said that he opposes annexation. He opposes it today, and he would oppose it as president as well. Now, what exactly that looks like in terms of the steps he would take in response were annexation to happen over the next few months is something he has not yet weighed in on, and so he is maintaining kind of his option set to decide how exactly he would react to it as president. But in addition to opposing it today, if he hasn't already made clear on the record, he intends to make clear on the record. He doesn't just oppose it today; he will oppose it as president, and he will take steps. What exactly those steps are, I think, is something that he's working through now.
And if one sort of gets out of the negative mode of being opposed to things like annexation, et cetera, and one tries to think a little bit more positively and proactively, the chances of diplomacy being undertaken that actually move us in the right direction, I think most people in the foreign policy community that you and I move around in are relatively pessimistic about the chances that a new diplomatic initiative could be launched in an early stages in a new administration. So what would you say is the right approach then? If there isn't really a chance for a new initiative right away and we're sort of fending off some bad things, is there anything positive that a new administration could put on the table to try to begin to move the conflict in the right direction instead of the wrong direction?
Well, one of the first things the Vice President would do, in addition to deep consultations with the leadership in Israel on how they see the prospects for any kind of possible negotiation, would be to treat the Palestinian leadership as a partner rather than as an adversary, the way the Trump administration has done, so as to create a better possibility of deep consultation with both sides on this, in addition to intensive engagement with the key actors in the region, in Egypt and Jordan, in the Gulf and other places. I don't think that he is going to try to rush headlong into forcing parties back to the table when there doesn't seem to be great appetite on any side to have that happen. But I do think that he will be looking for steps that the various parties can take to create a more constructive environment. And he will be pressing the parties, both publicly and privately, to not take steps that further undermine or set back or push off even further the prospect of a negotiated outcome here. He has spoken quite directly about the issue of settlement expansion. He has spoken quite directly about the need for the Palestinian leadership to be as constructive as possible in its relations and public statements towards Israel and the Israeli people. And so a lot of what he would be trying to do in the early phase would just be restoring a more effective U.S. presence as trying to work effectively with all of the parties involved in this in a way that is pointing them in a direction that is actually durable and sustainable, and to stop the, frankly, increasing slide towards an inevitable scenario where an effective peace is essentially no longer a plausible option.
Specifically with regard to the Palestinians, we have a question that asks, the PLO mission was closed in Washington, D.C. The consulate in East Jerusalem was folded under the embassy. Aid, both humanitarian as well as economic development assistance, was cut off for Palestinian projects. Would those kinds of steps be reversed in the early stages of a Biden administration?
Yeah, so the vice president has said that, he's got to be consistent with various acts of Congress, but his goal will be to re-engage the Palestinians and reverse a number of those steps, because he believes that they haven't been constructed towards America's security, towards Israel's security, towards Palestinian rights and interests, or towards the cause of producing progress on the peace track.
And the embassy moved symbolically into a smaller facility in Jerusalem with a lot of the staff still in Tel Aviv. Somebody's asking a question, would President Biden move the embassy back to Tel Aviv? I think I've heard from folks in the Biden circle that the actual embassy itself is unlikely to move, but the question I have for you is, would there be the openness to some kind of a reciprocal, at least gesture, to say that there's an understanding on the part of the United States that one day there might well be an embassy to the state of Palestine in the eastern part of the city?
So to the first part of the question, the vice president was opposed to the moving of the embassy, thought it was done in a way that didn't advance the interests of peace in the region. But he's also said that he's not intending now to undo it. I think he does want to take steps to reassure and reinforce for the Palestinians that they will have the dignity of an effective U.S. diplomatic presence. I don't know, candidly, the answer to the question about where he stands on what you just posed, which is, could he say, in addition to this, we imagine an embassy in East Jerusalem? You've actually asked me that question before. I've intended to get an answer, which I haven't done yet, but I will see if I can do so.
I'm relatively predictable on a lot of these issues. So there was a question somebody asked at the top, which we opened up by talking a little bit about it, sort of a Biden worldview, a Biden doctrine. You laid out some principles. And the question was asked at that point. It's easy in a sense to lay out Biden principles and to distinguish them from a Trump administration. But is there anything that you can point to where you would say that it's different from what an Obama administration did, that there's a difference, that a Biden administration in the 2020s would be doing things differently than an Obama administration did in the 2010s? But I want to focus that in on this issue, on Israel-Palestine. Are there lessons? A lot hasn't worked, obviously, right? Here we are, it's 2020, and this conflict still festers and going in the wrong direction. So it's not as if the Obama years bear the burden. Everybody has failed in what they've tried to date. So what are some of the lessons of what's been done wrong and hasn't worked that you think need to be applied, particularly with relation to Israel-Palestine when one looks ahead?
Well, as somebody who spent a lot of time on planes with George Mitchell in the 2009-2010 period, and then a fair amount of time in the Oval Office with the Vice President and President Obama when John Kerry would come back and report on his efforts. I got to see
first-hand seat.
Personal, both. In fact, the last time that Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas were in the same room together, as if I'm not mistaken, was 2010. Where they're in the same room for actual peace negotiations, was the 3 sets of meetings that they did, hosted by Secretary Clinton and Senator Mitchell, one in Washington, one in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, pre-Arab Spring, and one in the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. And I remember sitting in the third of those, which was in Jerusalem, and listening to the 2 men talk about the very hard issue of the Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley on a going forward basis in the context of a final status agreement. And just thinking, gosh, we think about bringing these guys together and the goal is build trust, build some sense of momentum, but we're not quite achieving that here. And then it was I'm not going to say desperate, but aggressive effort on our part to just keep it going, to salvage it, to get back to the table. And so I think one of the lessons is really, it's interesting. President Obama took the lesson from the Bush administration that waiting till towards the end was a mistake, and that you had to start right away. And so he immediately dispatched Mitchell to begin the process of trying to get those direct negotiations. My view is coming into a Biden administration, if he's fortunate enough to win in November, going headlong into let's try to get a negotiation going, it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. It is really about seeing how we can set the conditions and stop the continuing damage before it becomes utterly irreversible. And so honing in on that as a narrower, more modest set of goals that is frankly in its own right quite an ambitious undertaking, I think will be the biggest factor from the Vice President's perspective. It doesn't mean there will not be a huge amount of time and energy spent on this issue from the very top. There will. The Vice President himself is personally deeply invested in it. It just means the nature of that engagement will be much more stepwise and built around first trying to play some defense against a further backsliding of these efforts, and then reverse it to play some offense going forward. And I would just say, zooming out from the immediate issue, one of the other things that I think is different between 2020 and 2008 is the degree to which that issue of the U.S. defending the free world, defending democracy, is a much more present element of what a Biden foreign policy would be than the way that it was conceived of in 2008, with the rise of authoritarianism, populism, and the pressures on the Western democratic and economic model. That also is quite a different factor here, which, yes, on the one hand is also less ambitious, but in another sense is still is more modest, but in another sense is still deeply ambitious in the project that President Biden would be trying to pursue.
So another thing that shifted, I think, between 2008 and 2020 is the atmosphere in this country on issues of race and justice, and the sense that the value system that we stand for, and the issues that we are dealing with here need to also apply abroad. And I think one of the difficult things on the Israel issue for the Jewish community and for many of us is the way in which the situation for Palestinians is in so many ways has parallels to the situation of oppressed peoples in this country. And I think that the atmosphere today and the tolerance for a system that oppresses another people is lower. Do you think that that atmosphere in this country has the potential to shift the way that the United States approaches the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to look at it more as a struggle for rights than necessarily a struggle between two people that are arguing over a piece of land?
I think I wouldn't quite divide it that neatly, because I think even before there was a growing recognition of the deeply human dimension of this and what it meant in terms of rights, what it meant in terms of questions of justice, what it meant in terms of what the end game would look like, not just in terms of lines on a map, but for the type of life and dignity that a people enjoyed. I think that there is growing momentum behind that. I think the way that Democrats generally, and the vice president too, frame the issue around Palestinian rights is more robust and more centered along the lines of what you just described. And frankly, the vice president would say, if he were on right now, there is nothing inconsistent between being a strong supporter of the state of Israel and its security and its democracy and its long-term future as a Jewish state, and believing deeply in trying to deliver an outcome that also vindicates the rights of Palestinians, and an end game in which they have full rights and dignity in a state of their own. So I think that the energy in our country, the broader global question around where values fit into foreign policy, and the struggle between nationalist forces and those who believe in this basic concept of the rights of the individual and the rights of peoples. I think that is different in 2020 than it has been before, even as what is unchanged is, at least from Vice President Biden's perspective, a deep and abiding love and commitment and passion for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship and a robust commitment to Israel's security going forward.
Right, and we've discussed before that it's not only not inconsistent, it's actually necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I said it in kind of the defensive way, because you get the incoming from other quarters.
Right.
When you live in a campaign like I do, you're often thinking in terms of the negative rather than the positive, so it can be distorting. But I think actually it's an extremely helpful corrective, because it's actually slightly incorrect to say it's not inconsistent, because it's not quite capturing the truth of it, which is that true long-term security and vindication of Israel's vitality as a secure, democratic Jewish state fundamentally rests on the vindication of Palestinian rights. And I think that is a completely fair and important point to make, and one that I think has arisen in the consciousness of people, and frankly, to the good, because I think it can create momentum for a positive outcome here that benefits all, and also leaves the U.S.-Israel relationship in an even stronger place.
Right, and that has always been the core of J Street's premise. That the pro-Israel position actually is to ensure that Palestinian people get their freedom and their rights. Because if Palestine comes into existence, if there is a state, that means that Israel can be secure and have borders and be accepted and recognized in the region and around the world, and remain democratic and the national home of the Jewish people. And that's the only way it can. So neither side will get what they want if the other doesn't get it. It has to be a win-win. Have you seen, I don't know if you happened to see the Peter Beinart op-ed in the New York Times recently, in which he's somebody who, in the liberal Zionist world that we work in, has been a real a leader, a thought leader for us. And this past week, he wrote a piece in the New York Times that said that he's given up on a two-state solution. He thinks that there's not really a way to get there anymore, and that the only approach is a one-state outcome. And I don't know if you had a chance to read this or hear about it, but I'm curious your reaction to this growing trend, particularly on the left. And I think it's also true on the right. You have people on the right who want one state, you have people on the left, and those of us in the middle arguing for two states now get it, as you said, from the incoming on all sides. Yeah. Curious if you had any reaction to that piece or that line of thinking.
I did see the piece, and as you say, it's reflective of and consistent with a growing drumbeat from certain quarters of people who are, and not even always ideological quarters. There's also, people who don't belong in any particular ideological camp who just look at the situation and say, we're getting to a point where it's implausible to really think about a viable two-state solution. I'm not there. I understand it, because people have been at this for so long, and the constant incantation of the various formulas has not resulted in actual progress. And so I can, I have a certain degree of just kind of general understanding of why people would say, all right, I give up. I myself have at various points wanted to throw up my hands and walk away from some of the intensive negotiations in this area. But I don't think we have reached the point where that kind of conclusion should be reached by American leaders. I think the United States should remain committed to trying to first preserve and then advance a two-state outcome. I still think that is what is in the best interests of Israelis, of Palestinians, of the broader region. I still think that there is a viable pathway to get there. And I think the United States should find the set of steps and the sustainable strategy that can help drive us in that direction. And that's not to say that one should look at people making arguments against it and just sort of entirely reject them at fringe. You gotta see what's behind that argument and say, okay, what in it really needs to be dealt with and engaged with in a serious and sustained way that goes beyond the conclusion. That, the premises of the argument have to be contended with, to have a serious undertaking at this policy. But I'm not yet in a place where I'm willing to say, no to two states. And frankly, I also do worry that the more those of us who have passionately believed in the two-state solution for a long time kind of grow weary of it and say, okay, well, now it's done. I actually think we are giving more aid and comfort to those who, are just looking for a deeply negative outcome to this whole thing entirely, not looking for a positive outcome to it. So I will continue to resist that argument for now, even as I understand why some people are making it.
Great. Well, you'll be happy to know that J Street is right there with you, and we will be there to support that as hopefully the policy of a new administration. There are a series of other issues that I just want to briefly mention. We probably have about 5-10 minutes of your time left. I don't want to overstay our welcome with you. One area that J Street has taken very seriously in this Trump era was not part of our original mandate, but given who we are as an organization and the Jewish people's experience, we've been very concerned with the refugee and asylum policies of this administration. And I'm curious if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of the types of changes that a Biden administration might put on the table in those two areas.
Yeah. So one thing I would encourage everybody to read is the statement the Vice President put out on World Refugee Day, which was just a short while ago. It is a very bold statement, both about the cap of refugees, which has proposed increasing to unprecedented levels, but actually a floor, which is a kind of new concept that you haven't heard presidential candidates talk about before, that he would commit not just to saying, I'm going to raise the cap and we'll take up to this many, but we are going to make sure as the United States, we are delivering on refugee processing to let tens of thousands of people per year get into the United States who are deserving and for whom the US should be offering a safe refuge and a long-term home. More broadly, that statement talks about the US returning to a global leadership role in terms of dealing with this crisis, which is the world's, is the historic level of refugee flows not seen since the Second World War, and for which the absence of meaningful US engagement and in fact destructive policies, both at home and abroad, have just meant more needless pain and suffering around the world. So the vice president, even in the context of an election where refugee policy is not exactly the most popular policy in the world, has been absolutely full-throated because he believes it personally, passionately, that this is what the example of our power, the power of our example means, not just the example of our power. And so it's an issue on which you can expect to see a kind of night and day dynamic unfold if he's elected and gets the chance to replace the repugnant refugee policies of the Trump administration.
So I'll just make a quick comment to the J Street staff that are monitoring this. A couple of people in the Q&A are asking for links to some of the statements that Jake is indicating. So I'm just wondering if our staff, while we're on this Zoom, could put into the chat links, for instance, the Refugee Day statement and a couple of the other speeches that have been made so that folks can link to that also when we put this into the archives. Shifting hemispheres, also in the spirit of just an eclectic set of questions that we all are very interested in, it relates to immigration and this concept of a wall. The president has been pursuing the construction of the wall, and it is in fact, sections of it are being built. How do you see that being dealt with in the next administration? If there is progress being made towards building a wall, does it get canceled? What would be the approach in dealing with that?
Yeah, the vice president's made clear he's not investing American taxpayer dollars in Donald Trump's border wall. And he's not deploying thousands and thousands of US troops to the border. Another deployment announced just in the last few weeks to add further troops to the border when those folks could be, for example, helping on testing, tracing, and hospital capacity in places that right now are completely overrun in some of the southern states. So he's minced no words and made no bones about this. He would end the border wall project and instead invest those resources in a sane and humane immigration policy that would, among other things, include a surge of immigration judges and other support personnel to the border to be able to handle and process asylum claims and otherwise deal with the issue of those who have been detained there. And of course, he believes, we need to secure our border, but he believes that we can do so in a much more cost-effective way through strengthening ports of entry and through technological solutions that don't involve thousands of miles of border wall that's essentially a vanity project for Donald Trump.
You mentioned the question of how U.S. taxpayer dollars are spent. So I'm going to bring us back to Israel-Palestine, because one of the issues that has been raised recently is the question of whether or not it is appropriate for the United States to consider some level of restrictions on the aid that is provided to Israel. So for instance, I think it was Senator Chris Van Hollen and 13 other senators last week introduced an amendment to the NDAA that would restrict any dollars under that authorization from being spent to implement annexation. That kind of aid use restriction is not uncommon across the American budget to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent in accordance with our interests in our policies. Do you see that as a tool in the toolkit? I mean, is that a legitimate topic for conversation when it comes to the aid package that we do provide to Israel? If it is to be shown that certain material or equipment or other dollars are being spent in ways that do facilitate policies that run against our interests, do you think it's appropriate to have that on the table?
I haven't actually had the opportunity to ask the vice president about the Van Hollen amendment. He has been quite vigorous in his view that in general aid conditionality to security aid with respect to Israel is not something that he thinks is the right policy for the United States. Whether that extends to the question of the use of American equipment and so forth in an annexation context, I have to confess I don't know exactly where he is. I think, just given his overall view on the question of aid conditionality, he might just think, I'd like to find other ways to try to deal with issues around annexation than that one. But I don't know for sure.
Great. Let me just give you a chance. We're sort of coming to the end of the hour, and I want to come back, sort of full circle. There's a number of questions here about what we discussed at the beginning, which relates to military spending, the nuclear budget, nuclear arsenal, tying back into the Green New Deal. Just a lot of questions that go back to that budgeting priority. And perhaps in a way of closing, if you wanted to give us a sense of, you mentioned a $2 trillion investment package for the technologies of the new economy. Could you give us a little bit more detail about where it is that the Vice President would see that, that you said he outlined this week? People really want to know more about where would the money come from and where would you see the investments going?
Sure. So the Vice President's Jobs and Economic Recovery Package, he calls it Build Back Better, has sort of four major pillars. The first was he announced last week, and it is a $700 billion plan for investments in federal procurement and research and development, which essentially are mobilizing substantial resources to drive American manufacturing, supply chains, and technology and innovation base so that the US is more resilient in future crises, but also so that we're powering job creation in the industries of the future. This week, he talked about a $2 trillion investment in infrastructure and clean energy. And then next week, he'll be laying out a set of proposals around investments in childcare and home health care that will create jobs and also lower costs for families. And through all of this, he's placing a special emphasis on racial equity and inclusion because of the immense need for us not just to invest in the United States, but to pay attention to the systemic racism in our economy and try to remedy that. That entire package, a substantial portion of all of the continuing costs, anything that is not a one-time investment, he is going to show how he will pay for it through a tax increase on corporations from 21 to 28%, tax increases on the wealthy. No one making $400,000 a year or less will see their taxes go up, but he is making a number of reforms to the tax code that will ask millionaires and the super wealthy to pay their fair share. So he's going to pay for all of his continuing costs. He believes some element of this, some of the infrastructure, some of the research and development money, some of the direct federal procurement spending, emergency spending in the early years, will be one-time expenditures that will be seen as stimulus. He's consulted broadly with even fiscal hawks about whether this makes sense given the crisis we're up against, the magnitude of unemployment we're likely to face, the long-term hole in our economy. And the resounding answer he has gotten back is that for our country's long-term fiscal health, making these productive investments now will put us on a sounder fiscal footing a decade from now than if we just tried to, basically count beans over the course of the next year or so. On things like the nuclear budget and modernizing the defense budget, the Vice President has been clear, we have got to look for cost savings. The numbers on the nuclear budget are just eye-popping, and finding ways to maintain a stable and effective nuclear deterrent without having to spend at the levels that have been described is something that he has tasked his team to take a close look at, among other things in the defense space.
Terrific. Well, Jake, it's always great to spend some time talking with you about not only the specific issues, but the big issues and the big picture and the American role. And we know you've got a huge, huge task in the next 3.5 months on the campaign, and we'll be right there with you to ensure that we don't.
We all have a huge, huge task. That's the thing. I mean, this is genuinely an all hands on deck effort. Every phone call, every conversation with a friend, every idea you send in for how we can do better, every dollar you can give. I mean, this is like no stone unturned from anyone and everyone who wants to see a better America emerge from what has been a a year of crisis and a presidency of crisis.
And J Street is all in. We've never before endorsed in a presidential race. This is the first time, and we're happy to stand with Vice President Biden and to do everything we can. And every ounce of our energy will be focused on this for the next 3.5 months. But every so often, we like to talk a little bit about what 2021 could look like. It gives us the inspiration to go out and do the next phone bank and write the next check and recruit the next friend. So thank you for providing a little bit of that vision and inspiration. And we look forward to working with you in this endeavor for 3.5 months and then hopefully beyond to implement the vision you've laid out.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. And thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks so much, Jake. Take care. Bye, everybody. We'll see you soon.